Good morning once again, and welcome to session 2 of the Conservation Careers Fair Day 1. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you as we talk to Jimmiel Mandima from I4. I'm sure you've been watching us on Facebook and on Instagram, and you're excited to hear more from Jimmiel about his work. And Jimmiel started off as a researcher in Zimbabwe and now works on Capitol Hill in Washington. So we have titled his talk From Zimbabwe, or From the African Savannah to Capitol Hill. Thank you so much for joining us, Jimmiel. I will let you just immediately get started, introduce yourself, and get on with your talk.
Thank you, Louis, and again, good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. My name is Jimmiel Mandima, and I work for the International Fund for Animal Welfare as the Deputy Vice President of Conservation based in Washington, D.C., the headquarters. I will share this morning just the story of my career journey. It's pretty personal, and I hope as I talk about it, you accept it as a humble way of just motivating to tell a story of beginnings that start in a typical African village and ends up in Washington, as Louis just said. From the Savannah to Washington, D.C., I could also say my career pathway is a story of learning and discovering along the way. And it all starts with grassroots beginnings. I grew up in a typical African village in the southern part of Zimbabwe, in the area called Masvingo, if you can see it on the map there, further down there. And what typically happens, like for most of you that would have actually had that privilege to live in a village, is you do village chores, herding livestock, you do farming, you walk or run to school barefooted. But in the process, it was my first interaction with nature, because each time you go herding cattle or goats, once in a while, in the early days during my time, you would easily lose some livestock to hyenas. You would be afraid of getting into forests because they were very thick and healthy. You would go swimming in the local rivers, almost, playing games with crocodiles, keeping it very tough. You'd climb hills. So nature was just part and parcel of what we would do. We would go gathering fruits in the wild. They were plentiful then. We would go, collecting firewood because it was plentiful. So I literally caught my passion for conservation intuitively by living it, because it was what drove our lives. But like every person growing in a rural African context, you then transition to an urban setting when you go to high school, go to college. And for me, because of that interest and engagement with nature, I chose to pursue at the University of Zimbabwe a degree in sciences. A decision that, in fact, was seen as awkward, because when you grow up, you see doctors, you see pharmacists, engineers. I had done sciences in high school and actually qualified to go into those tracks, which are supposedly more paying. But my interest in understanding just the balance of nature, the intersection with people that I'd actually lived, led me to decide to pursue biology, chemistry, and geography in college as a general, and then specialized eventually in biological sciences honors. During the course of my college life, I got to be part of a team that would undertake field studies to the Zambezi Valley in Kariba. So that boat you see with the sunset there is really the carpenter fishing rigs that for most of you, if you are from Zambia and others from the region, would be familiar with. And while we were doing that, I was able to actually also live a life where wildlife coexisted with people in the town of Kariba on the Zimbabwean side, and the same obtains if you cross over to Siavonga. In our work, we would go out to really do the botany on land, look at communities along the shoreline, do water sampling and analyze it, look at all the critters that exist. And that in itself was steps towards practicing conservation. And also realizing Lake Kariba itself is a park, and then the area around it, Jawara Safari area, is also a park. After college, I had studied biological sciences honors. I loved teaching, just being able to share what I believed in as a passion. And I thought what I've put down there are various schools in Zimbabwe, Ascot, Fletcher, they are in the Midlands, in the center of the country, and Zengeza just outside there, Harare. I have to say I'm humbled by knowing that a good number of my own students during that short stint of teaching have gone ahead to pursue some incredible careers, some in conservation. They remind me, because at times I forget when I meet them, and others in the medical sciences, engineering, etc. And most of them are also ambassadors, African ambassadors worldwide. While I was teaching, after a few months after college, I got a privilege to pursue postgraduate studies, and it was an invitation with funding to a place, one, I'd never traveled out of the country, and two, it meant going to Scandinavia, the northern part of Europe, which is extremely cold, the exact opposite of where I'm accustomed in our tropics, in our lovely Southern Africa. So it took this confidence, even with the ignorance that went with it, of saying, let me venture into the unknown, a land so-called a land of 1,000 lakes. And this again was to go and study fisheries. The connection was I'd had the opportunity to interact in Lake Kariba, but also knowing that when you study fisheries, you're looking at the aquatic system linked to the terrestrial system, and the lakes in Finland just offered that experience for me. And while I was there, we did, as you see in the photo montage there, is really, I would do ice fishing, something you can ever think about, where you have in winter to crack the frozen surfaces of lakes by drilling, and then sit on a chair with a flask of coffee with gloves and start fishing. Just again, as part of learning, we would go trolling, and there you see with colleagues in the center picture there, just identifying fish after spending time in the Baltic Sea and doing all the trolling. It's again learning about nature, about critters, which then becomes important when you start practicing conservation. Tried skiing, it was a little bit late in my age, fell a little bit here and there, but it's about learning, it's about discovering, it's about pushing yourself, doing the things you don't always do. And it is what I believe takes anybody who pursues a career in conservation to do. And then after my master's, I was back in the home country, which is always preferable, which I know most of you listening are doing, serving our countries. That because I'd been exposed to the Valley, I bounced back as an employee of the University of Zimbabwe as a research fellow, based at a research center in Kariba town, which is a town where elephants roam and walk to bedroom windows. And what that means is conflict, with people being killed or being injured. And in addition to my research work, which was my full-time job, I then became one of those volunteers as a member of the Wildlife Society of Zimbabwe, which during my time of joining the leadership became known as the Wildlife Environment Zimbabwe to date. And what we were doing is to work with the local, in municipality to identify wildlife corridors within the town of Kariba to avoid any housing developments or anything that could block movement of elephants, of buffaloes to the lakeshore and to the valleys in the hills. We would do feasibility studies for any development within town, the idea being to minimize encroachment of human settlements into the safari area. And fortunately, the Wildlife Society was given an area to lease from the Department of Parks then, and because I was in the leadership of Wildlife Society, we started managing it to do fire management, all the fire guards, the road networks in the area, doing anti-poaching with local scouts who were employees of Wildlife Society, working with school kids to do anti-snaring. And that was all voluntary. I wasn't paid for it. I didn't need to be paid for it. I'd always loved being in nature from the very beginnings, as I told you earlier on. And so that's my journey back in the valley, practicing hands-on. And as part of Wildlife Society, I was among some of the early Zimbabwean, Black Zimbabweans to pursue an agenda to roll out environmental education around schools, because we realized it takes educating and exposing the younger generation to nature and systems of the real intricate relationship between the hunting and gathering our ancestors did, but now with modernity, understanding the need to balance our footprint with these systems that drive sustainability. So we set up a very nationwide environmental education program, and in Kariba, an educational museum. For those that know Kariba, coming from Harare into the city, you kind of come through that education dormitories for campsites. Kids would come from all over the country to learn, go on the lake. And it was, the story is, I was part of many other Zimbabweans and international well-wishers and partners that pushed this agenda. And I saw myself getting the satisfaction from doing this voluntarily. And then as it was to be my early days in the nonprofit world, I was already tenured with the University of Zimbabwe. Tenured means you probably won't be fired. And then when African Wildlife Foundation came to explore with the government of Zimbabwe what needed to be done and whether there was space for them, they typically, like most of us doing NGO sector, consult on the needs, which is the scoping, the science planning, and I participated as a member of the University of Zimbabwe doing research. Then fast forward, when they decided to start a program in the Zambezi Valley, which was transboundary, including Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, what most of you, if you are familiar, is called the ZIMOZA, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia transboundary area. I joined them, so literally leaving my tenured job to join an NGO that pursued conservation on a 2-year contract. You might think it's kind of not very smart, because if they ran out of money after 2 years, I was unemployed. But I took the leap of faith again, learning as I go. I spent the first 2 years as a project officer, transitioned to start leading the program in that landscape, was part of the team with African Wildlife Foundation that really started some of the baseline studies in the Kavango Zambezi area under what was called the Four Corners Project. It is what has now become the biggest trans-frontier conservation area at Kaza. And in Zambezi, I was also part of many other transboundary working groups, including the Environmental Management Working Group that was facilitated by Zambezi River Authority, the various environmental management authorities in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and did a lot of work that required standardizing and sharing experiences across lakeshore management, as well as the quality of water in the shared water resources. So early days in the field, I just want to pivot and say, I'm not talking as somebody who did it alone. I had to be mentored. I worked with leaders from all over the world. And the gentleman who is on the photo here, we were pretty young then, is my CEO at African Wildlife Foundation, Patrick Bergen, who had spent many years in Tanzania as a Peace Corps and would come to the fields with me as a young leader there, would go to Lower Zambezi National Park. Often just the two of us spend a whole week there talking about what are the issues, Jimmiel? What do you understand as a person who comes from here? What do the chiefs want? What do the headmen want? What do the local people want? What do the government say? How do we build the bridges? What about the investments when lodges are coming up in Lower Zambezi across these areas? How do we balance that? And it's understanding how the pieces come together, thinking about the future we want, about the quest for development which we need, but without destroying the very attractions that most people that come from all over the world come to see. So I spend a lot of time in the field with Patrick and with other colleagues as well. Go down to Kaora Bassa, the confluence of the Zambezi and the Luangwa, seeing the fishermen, seeing the trade with so many women contributing to the economy by going to buy fish in Mozambique and coming back to sell them at various markets. But there are so many socio-economic dynamics in that process, where there's issues around HIV, AIDS, issues around families staying away from each other, and conservation, which you are pursuing or which you'll be interested in, which I encourage you to look at, is it's not just a siloed profession. It involves everything coming together. And I'm actually now more and more talking about conservation development. So the field will continue. It took me to the Democratic Republic of Congo. We see those motorcycles. This is a fantastic country endowed with resources, but we all know the challenges that we continue to face in that country and the other countries. You would go on a motorbike ride for 300 kilometers along, pathways, or what you think is a pathway, with very tall grass and shrubs at high speed for you to make the distance. And this is the life most men and women that are rangers and out there sacrificing to protect are doing. So I managed to expose myself to that. It's a privilege. So I don't take the credit for it. Went to many places. The other photo is obviously Lower Zambezi from the Manapu side, with one of my colleagues who actually reminded me that, by the way, I'm now a guide because I used to listen to your talks in Kariba in the early days, and I got encouraged. And I was like, well, I'm happy that you have pursued the profession. Then a few years later, back in 2010, African Wildlife Foundation said, you know what, in Washington, DC, decisions are made in the capitals of the Western world to support programs in Africa all over the world. And it is good for somebody who has had a privilege to work from the grassroots and to do hands-on work to be on the table, to engage and hopefully influence the development of strategies or any legislation for issues that will connect to the work we do in conservation. So I transitioned to now start doing policy engagement. One could ask, you studied biology and chemistry, now you're doing policy, did you actually train for it? In some ways, it's about exploring the things you do not know, exercising those muscles that are not strongest, than focusing on the strongest piece. And in most postgraduate studies anyway, you do a lot of public administration policy, at least as modules. But this was my chance for me to chat into new waters, getting out of my comfort zone. That took me to places like Rio +20 when we were chatting the future globally from the United Nations of Development Agenda. It took me to many offices on Congress. The US government is the three branches. There's the federal executive branch that is looking at international conservation, the support, the USAID, the Department of State, the Department of Interior, US Fish and Wildlife Service. These are partners in conservation for many African countries, including our own countries. So I was spending time with colleagues there that mean well and want to help, and being able to unpack the nuances around what happens in our situations, in our landscape, so that people would know that when we advance support, including technical support, it has to be relevant, it has to be approached and focused on these priorities so that it is owned by the governments, by the local communities, and it is our voice, is the African voice, that started speaking that. I would go to various conventions, like in everything. I think what is key as I talk about this transition is the great work you all do, we all do on the continent, in our countries. The best practices we see and test and see that they work. They've got to inform the policy decisions that are taken at international platforms and at the end of the day, set the agenda for global development. If we don't tell those stories, we do great work, it gets stuck in the trenches because nobody of the key decision makers, the key funders, the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility, and various conventions take it on board. So it takes the role I ended up playing at that point, and many others, by the way. So this is my story, but there are so many other stories, incredible ones. And I hope that in future, you could also tell the same story. So I would go to these meetings. You had the big spike in poaching where there was a global undertaking, the US government making decisions to have a inter-agency task force to destroy stocks of ivory that had been confiscated. I would be on the table with other leaders. I would go to various summits to talk about the African situation, the contentious debates about consumptive versus non-consumptive use, articulating from a context of the African voice, what the communities need, what the cultural and traditions are, and how to balance that. Engaging policies and think tanks, going to various legal platforms, going to the various assemblies that draw 10,000s of people participating on panels to just be part of the conversation. And I've always said, and many of us say, it's about the African voice. We look at conservation if you go through the colonial era where it was seen as a preserve of the Western or tree huggers. But in reality, we are the best stewards if you think about it, because we have always coexisted as hunters and gatherers. We continue to live with wildlife, either being affected negatively, and how do we change that to make it positive? So that is how I transitioned through my career pathway to come to DC. And in the process, if you push an agenda, you have to communicate in media. So you go to interviews, talk to various platforms. You may have heard about the Clinton Global Initiative, talk to the Clintons. And I have to encourage and say, the African voice is needed because in many platforms, it's not unusual to find that you may be the only Black African in the room, especially talking about conservation. It could look intimidating, but I always have taken it as a learning opportunity and the confidence that is inspired by the passion of knowing that I belong in Africa. We are actually privileged to have this heritage. You really get the confidence to speak for it, and you gain respect from peers who are Americans and Westerners that really mean well, but are always open to say, tell me, what is it like? What actually works? So that's my journey. And lastly, I want to talk about the organization that I now work for, because that journey, which I've talked up to now, was with African Wildlife Foundation. And then literally 2 years ago, I transitioned to join the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And what this organization does is now to, again, push me to a different level, to learn new things. IFO looks at animal welfare and wildlife conservation, which with a very clear mission of rolling out what we believe should be fresh thinking and bold action for animals, people, and the habitats to be sustained. Fresh thinking and bold action because the development quest, as we know it in Africa and everywhere globally, is high. And as you develop, you are likely to put pressure on the resources. And we need to have really fresh thinking that is embedded on communities and people. We believe that animals and people can coexist and thrive together, and that balance is key. And when you think of our countries where we hail from, it is about the people's voice. It is about the African voice. It is about all of you on this call that need to be talking about it. So with International Fund for Animal Welfare, I'm now able to travel globally because the agenda for IFO is international. We have a big program in China. We have a big growing program in Oceania, Australia. We respond to disasters, the fires, the floods. We rescue, domestic animals in these situations. We have a huge program on marine conservation, which connects, if you think about my story about going to Finland, to some of the issues I learned before and have not had a chance to practice in the marine sector. I'm now part of that team. We do a lot of policy engagement at CITES, at CBD, and all these places to talk about what we have learned in the ground. And I count myself as having had the privilege, with humility, to walk from grassroots to this stage where I'm now able to be part of a fantastic organization with a global agenda, but still remain as an African, saying, let the African voices, the young African professionals listening today, pursue professions in conservation. Don't think it is siloed, it is a whole broad spectrum, because you end up being a generalist looking at development issues, socioeconomic issues, community issues, but still focus on the heritage we have as Africa, the wildlife, the forests, so that we don't destroy them, but you become stewards to influence the policymakers. And I just want to end by saying, all you need in life is having some level of ignorance, because you don't know everything, but the confidence. Once you gain that confidence to explore, to do things that are not just your comfort zone, success is assured. You should seek out discomfort and push for new experiences. Don't just relax and think that maybe conservation is no money. I think satisfaction comes more from non-monetary issues. And I think conservation is where you feel that you leave a legacy and you can be part of the movement. I thank you, and I hope my story, with humility as shared, just encourages you and motivates you and educates you on the many things that you can do as an African to provide the African voice and to bring change. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmiel. That was very, very interesting and exciting. I especially love how you ended your talk mentioning that it's not just about money. I mean, money is very, very important, I'm sure, especially when you're starting out, but that's not the only thing to think about. And also, you mentioned seeking out discomfort, looking for ways to challenge yourself, because I think success is usually on the other side of such conversations or such experiences. So we have a few questions for you. We'll try and keep them short because we know you're very, very busy, as you mentioned. I think the first one, I'll start with what you said towards the end of your talk about being the only Black African in the room and sitting at these high-level conferences. And my question for you is, how do we get more Africans into these spaces? You mentioned Africa being, as Africans, this legacy being ours. These are our resources and we have to take care of them, and linking development with the environment. And all of that is absolutely necessary. In order to achieve this, we need Africans. But how do we get the young Africans into spaces such as yours?
Good question. I think it's just about looking out for those opportunities. I'm pretty well convinced that the global community is open to build capacity closest to the point of need and implementation. And if you look at a lot of the opportunities, whether it's scholarships and fellowship to study and to pursue professions, which ends up getting you a seat in these decision-making platforms, they are offered for the young generation. There's social media now, you can join movements globally, you get ahead, you get known. And just look out for this. I think it's about venturing to the unknown, which I think we often don't do. And I would only encourage that once you do that, people pick you and they notice you. Identify a few role models within Zambia, within your countries, that are connected with the global network. And that's how you build your own kind of steps. And once you get the seat on the table, don't shy off from speaking and say, actually, Victoria Falls in Zambia and Zimbabwe, it's not in Kenya or South Africa. Nothing wrong with those countries, but often these misperceptions are actually communicated by guys that just don't have an African voice on the table.
Yeah, completely agree, especially about finding role models and using your voice once presented with opportunities. We have another question here, slightly different from the one that I just asked you because we were focused more on Africa. She is based in the UK and she says, hi there, I'm watching your conservation career seminar from the UK and I have a question for Jimmiel. I'm currently studying at the university in the UK with particular focus on African wildlife. I've applied for jobs in the past in South Africa and some in East Africa, but being a foreigner limits my options because of visa restrictions. My question, should I finish my PhD and keep trying to get a job out there, or try and build my career around academia based in the UK, but with research in Africa? I know both are important, but what I really enjoy doing is field work. Also, thanks for these sections. I'm finding them very helpful and informative. So as a researcher or former researcher, now policymaker, what would you say for this young lady?
Thanks again for your interest and passion for Africa. I would recommend that because a good number of the NGOs are international with work in Africa, just volunteering or internships and identifying with under a funded grant, which most NGOs would have, would allow you to get a foot on the ground to do work. And also I like the other aspect of pursuing a research subject that is focused on fieldwork in Africa, where that could be funded through your academic institution, and that gives you a front row seat being in the field, collecting data and working with fellow Africans, with governments and communities. It's a combination of both. And I think, I see a lot of opportunities for fellowships and internships that are available. That might not pay you more money, but I see you have the passion. So invest in that, and then you get access to that.
Thank you for that, Jimmiel. Another question that I have is, you mentioned getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Would you say that is the reason you took this leap for being a tenured lecturer, knowing, like you said, you're almost guaranteed a job for the rest of your life? Lecturers very rarely get fired. And then switching to working with AWF, what made you take that gamble besides wanting to be uncomfortable?
I wish I could definitively say what, but I look back and think just those small baby steps I did in the village and getting to know nature and to enjoy it. And then having spent many years actually when I was working, volunteering for Wildlife Society, using my resources to go to meetings and spending many hours doing that voluntarily, essentially doing conservation for no salary. And now here was a chance to be paid while pursuing my dream. It just became like a no-brainer, but taking the risk because the caveat was 2-year contracts because we depend on funding. But we believe if you succeed, then we should continue to get funding. So one could say collectively as an organization, we succeeded because I continued with African Wildlife Foundation for 17 years. That's a long time. And then I'm still in the field. So it's that again, let's do it. I could probably bounce back and start being on probation as an academic if I had not gone beyond 2 years.
So it wasn't that much of a gamble. It was like a calculated gamble.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because even when my excitement in being part of the scoping and planning meetings was as a researcher that was my thinking, they'd get me small grants, I'll do my research, they get the data, they apply it and doing their NGO stuff. But then when they said, actually, we would want you to join us, I was, wait a minute. When I left for this meeting, my boss was like, go and explore more how as an institution you can get more money. So, and understandably, like, don't do that, it's a big risk, 2 years, But anyway, fast forward, I'm really looking back and saying it was meant to be, and it's again that venturing to the unknown, which is panned out well, yeah.
I agree. I know you spent the bulk of your talk talking more about your work initially and how you got into this field, but someone has a question. Inonge has a question about the work that you're doing now with IFO. Is IFO working on any wildlife conservation projects that are linked to preserving wildlife here in Africa? I know the answer to this, but I'll let you answer. And what successful policies have you achieved or lobbied for?
The last part of the question?
The first part was about the work that IFO is doing here in Africa. And then secondly, has I4 managed to lobby successfully for any policies to be changed?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those questions. Let me talk about what I love to do, what I do. Yes, we do have programs in Africa. We work on what we call landscape conservation, and it's mostly at transboundary level. We have a huge program in the Malawi-Zambia trans-frontier area, working in Kasungu National Park in Malawi, and then crossing over into Lukusuzi and Luambe in Zambia, and all the communities around that area connecting to the Luangwa system. That is ongoing, and it's looking at combating wildlife trafficking, all the anti-poaching processes, the anti-trafficking, and then community engagement, looking at opportunities for communities engaged. Then further going into Zimbabwe, we have a huge agenda, but growing from working within Wanke National Park as part of the CASA TFCA, again, doing issues of park management, anti-poaching support, providing infrastructure, and looking at communities outside the park on issues around human-wildlife conflict mitigation. And then we move into East Africa, where in the southern Kenya, Amboseli Tsavo system, transboundary with northern Tanzania into Arusha, that whole area into Kilimanjaro, we are doing similar work in securing land for movement corridors. So that's our footprint in Africa. And we also have a policy presence where from Nairobi in Malawi, we have policy advisory working with government parties to decide on positions to take when they go to the various international conventions. We have pushed for many years in the policy arena around the protections and listings of species that are endangered and threatened. And for us who come from Africa, it's around trade in elephant products and their other wildlife derivatives, ivory in particular, rhino horn, issues around how you utilize wildlife resources. And we have presented those policy positions together with government parties who host us. And from Africa, we always ensure we are aligning with that because we work with them along the way to issues around bans for ivory trade or decisions around minimizing that, how we should avoid incompatible developments. And then now moving into the Convention on Biological Diversity, looking at mainstreaming biodiversity in every sector. So each time we do roads, we do lodges, we do anything you can think about, which we need to do it in a judicious way that avoids damaging that. So those are the policy successes we continue to take. And then on the marine area, again, we're looking at the marine mammals that move long distances in trying to influence shipping lanes and also the emissions, boat speeds, and it's a whole arena of all that. I hope that's a snippet of what we are doing. Yeah.
Very much so. It's a bit overwhelming to think the wide array of things that you look at. Like you mentioned, something I'd never really thought about, shipping lanes. Good to know. Very, very exciting work. And then lastly, our final question is, the theme for this year's conservation careers fair is adaptability for survival. We've all had to adapt to this term that we now know, the new normal. How has your work had to change because of COVID and this new world that we live in? You mentioned a lot of travel. How is your job looking now that you can't travel to these places anymore? You can't be on the ground here in Zambia or in Malawi or in any of the other parts of the world where you usually go?
Great question. I think we have been really pushed and tested to the end. First of all, what we are doing right now, going virtual, is just what we all do today, and that's an adaptation I've had to do. I think all of a sudden, we have been able to explore as much as more than we've ever done to minimize our carbon footprint. And I think what this tells us is there are certain things that can go on and can be done and that can't wait simply because we can't travel. We have now learned to empower and to trust the different teams that are in different places, and from field offices to different country or regional teams, so that it doesn't have to take somebody from a home office headquarters to be on the ground to make a decision. We have learned to rely on partners, smart partnerships, where again, it takes a global village to make a difference to conservation in particular with climate change upon us. And that in itself is we have learned and adapted to expand our tent of players. Because if we wait for us to start flying to go to China or to go to Malawi, then things won't wait for us. But we have incredible players in the governments, in the local NGOs, in the communities where we can communicate and empower and be able to use other digital platforms to get things going. So that's what it is. And hopefully you guys are adapting, and I also look forward to learning from everybody sharing their stories. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jimmiel. We really appreciate it for taking the time. I know it's very, very early in the morning there for you. So thank you once again for taking the time to be here with us and to teach us about your story, the work that you do, why it's important. I know many young people have been impacted by this today, and hopefully we'll be seeing a lot more researchers, lecturers, policymakers going out there and changing the world because of this talk. And lastly, I want to wish you a happy Teachers' Day. Today, Monday, 5th October, is World Teachers' Day. I know you're still a teacher at heart. So have a good and lovely day. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I appreciate all the best to everybody online, and hope we continue to share the lessons. Cheers, and otherwise have a wonderful afternoon.